In February of 1989, a 41-year-old New Zealand businessman vanished from a rural highway for 10 days. And when he came back, he said he had proof he had spent that time somewhere not of this earth. Stay with me, because this is one of the strangest disappearance cases ever documented in the Southern Hemisphere, and decades later, nobody has been able to fully explain it. Alec Newald was not the kind of man anyone expected to become the center of a UFO mystery. He ran a small commercial design business in New Zealand. He had no history of mental illness, no interest in the paranormal, and no connection to any UFO research community. By every account from the people who knew him, he was practical, grounded, and unremarkable. On a February morning in 1989, he set out on a routine drive from Rotorua to Auckland, a trip that should have taken about 3 hours. He had a business meeting waiting for him on the other end. That drive never happened the way it was supposed to. His car was eventually found on the shoulder of a rural highway with the keys still in the ignition. Newald himself was found later, confused, disoriented, but physically unharmed. The strange part wasn't just that he had gone missing. It was that by his own sense of time, only a few hours had passed since he pulled over on that highway. According to the calendar, 10 days had gone by. Friends and family who had been searching for him during that time could verify exactly when he vanished and exactly when he turned up again. Something had clearly happened. The question that would consume the next 8 years of his life was simple. What? Newald didn't rush to tell a dramatic story. In fact, for years, he barely had a story to tell at all. His memory of those 10 days was fragmented at best. He recalled driving, then a strange gap, then suddenly being somewhere else with no understanding of how he got there. To reconstruct what happened, he turned to a long and careful process that included regression hypnosis with credentialed therapists, conversations with people who had searched for him, and years of cross-referencing his own recovered memories against what others remembered about his absence. Some of those memories came back gradually through hypnosis. Others surfaced on their own, unprompted, sometimes triggered by something as ordinary as a smell or a sound. He wrote these fragments down as they came, long before he ever published anything. By 1997, after 8 years of this slow reconstruction, Newald published a book called Coevolution. In it, he described what he claimed had happened during those missing 10 days, in far more detail than most people who report this kind of experience ever offer. According to his account, he was taken to a place he called Haven, a name he says was used by the beings who brought him there. He was careful to describe Haven not as a spaceship in the science fiction sense, but as something closer to a functioning society, an environment with structure, with social hierarchy, with its own internal logic. He described the beings there as humanoid, but distinctly not human, claiming they had been quietly observing Earth for a long time. He even gave names to specific individuals he says interacted with him, referring to 2 of them as Hugh and Selosi. This is where Newald's account stands apart from a lot of similar claims from that era. Many contact stories from the 1970s and 80s are vague. They describe glowing beings, feelings of peace, vague messages about cosmic brotherhood, with very little concrete detail to actually examine. Newald's story isn't like that. He describes physical layouts, social structures, and what he calls operational systems, the kind of specific, almost mundane detail that's hard to improvise on the spot and even harder to keep consistent over decades. And that consistency is part of what has kept researchers interested. For more than 30 years, in his book, in interviews, and at conferences, Newald has told essentially the same story. The names haven't changed. The details haven't shifted to fit new audiences. That kind of long-term stability is unusual, because most fabricated stories tend to drift over time as the person forgets earlier details or adds new ones to keep an audience engaged. According to people who have studied his case, Newald's account has simply stayed the same. One detail that has aged in an interesting way is what he describes as a warning. Newald says the beings at Haven express concern about Earth's environmental trajectory, describing a planet being damaged by a species that wasn't managing its resources well and wasn't prepared for the consequences of its own behavior. In 1989, this wasn't yet the dominant global conversation it would later become. The first major international climate report wouldn't be published until the following year, and the Rio Earth Summit was still 3 years away. None of this proves anything about where the warning actually came from. Climate concerns already existed among scientists at the time, and a thoughtful person paying attention to that research could have arrived at similar conclusions on their own. But the framing Newald describes wasn't political or activist in tone. He presents it as a detached, almost clinical observation from outsiders watching a system head toward failure. That framing has aged differently than a lot of the more sensational claims from that same period of contact literature. It's worth comparing Newald's story to two of the most famous cases in this space. Whitley Strieber's book Communion came out 2 years earlier, in 1987, and became a massive international bestseller about his own alleged abduction experiences. Some skeptics have suggested that Strieber's book may have shaped Newald's later memories, even unconsciously. Newald has consistently said he hadn't read Communion before his own incident, something that obviously can't be independently verified. But structurally, the two accounts read very differently. Strieber's story is psychological and fear-driven, focused on uncertainty and unease, with beings whose motives are left deliberately ambiguous. Newald's account is far more procedural, focused on places, systems, and named individuals, told in a tone that's more observational than frightened. Then there's the Travis Walton case from Arizona in 1975, probably the most famous missing time abduction story in American history, in which Walton was reportedly gone for 5 days after an encounter while working with a logging crew. Like Newald's case, Walton's disappearance was witnessed by other people, and his return was documented by those who knew him. Both cases share something that separates them from most contact stories: independent verification that something genuinely unusual happened, completely apart from the claimant's own account of what that something was. Nobody disputes that Walton vanished. Nobody disputes that Newald vanished. The disagreement is entirely about what filled that gap. When Coevolution was published, it didn't become a mainstream sensation. It never landed on a major bestseller list, and it wasn't widely distributed in big bookstore chains. It found its audience instead through Nexus magazine and through researchers who specialized in carefully evaluating contact claims rather than simply amplifying them. And yet, over the following 25 years, the book stayed in print. It was translated into multiple languages and developed a quiet but steady following among people who take this kind of research seriously. That kind of longevity is rare. Most stories like this generate a short burst of attention and then fade, with the claimant either disappearing from public view or drifting into the more commercialized end of the conference circuit. Newald's story has simply persisted. His own behavior afterward is part of what researchers point to as well. He didn't turn the experience into a media empire. He didn't release a string of sequels or build a paid membership community around his story. He gave interviews, he spoke at conferences, and he took part in research efforts including Stephen Greer's Disclosure Project and events tied to other UFO research organizations. But his financial trajectory never matched what you'd expect from someone deliberately exploiting public interest for profit. It looks, by most accounts, like the trajectory of someone who believes something happened to him and has spent decades simply trying to explain it. Independent organizations have also looked into the case. Ufocus New Zealand, founded by researcher Suzanne Hansen, has investigated multiple New Zealand contact cases, including aspects of Newald's story. Their documentation doesn't prove he was taken anywhere extraterrestrial. What it does establish is that he was genuinely missing, that real people searched for him during those 10 days, and that his personality changed noticeably after he returned. Multiple acquaintances who had no personal stake in validating or debunking his story later described him as quieter, more contemplative, and preoccupied with questions he had never shown interest in before. These observations came from people close to him at the time, not from researchers trying to build a narrative after the fact. That personality shift is probably the hardest part of this case for skeptics to dismiss outright. People who fabricate elaborate stories typically maintain whatever persona serves the hoax for as long as the story is useful to them, then quietly slip back toward who they were before. Newald never went back to his old baseline. The change in him appears to have been permanent. That leaves two uncomfortable possibilities. Either something genuinely extraordinary happened to him, or he experienced some kind of profound psychological event that produced both the story and the lasting change in his personality at the same time. Neither explanation is simple, and neither one lets us walk away from this case feeling settled. It's important to be clear about what we actually know versus what remains a personal claim. We know Newald disappeared for 10 days in February 1989. We know his car was found abandoned with the keys still in it. We know multiple people searched for him and can verify the timeline of his absence and return. We know his personality changed afterward in ways observed by people who had nothing to gain from supporting or denying his story. What we don't know, and what no document, hypnosis session, or eyewitness account can prove, is what actually happened to him during those 10 missing days. Newald's description of Haven, of the beings he calls Hugh and Selosi, of an advanced society watching over a struggling Earth, remains his account of events. It has never been independently verified, and it has never been definitively disproven either. 35 years later, Alec Newald is still telling essentially the same story he started telling in the 1990s. The names are the same. The details are the same. Whether that consistency reflects genuine memory of something extraordinary, a deeply convincing personal belief held with remarkable stability, or something else entirely, is something every person looking at this case has to decide for themselves. What's not in dispute is that something happened on that highway between Rotorua and Auckland in February of 1989, that a man went missing for 10 days he can't fully account for, and that he came back changed in ways that the people who knew him noticed immediately and never stopped noticing. The 10 days are still unexplained. The questions are still open, and after 35 years, that unresolved gap remains exactly what it was the day Alec Newald first tried to make sense of it. If you found this case as strange as I did, let me know in the comments what you think really happened during those 10 days. And subscribe for more deep dives into the most carefully documented mysteries that mainstream explanations still haven't managed to put to rest.